with me, right? These things exist on the spectrum. Okay, give me a second. I'm gonna join the call with them.
Go.
Hey.
I don't know exactly when JB's gonna join. Oh, it's up, Asmon.
Not much, man. Just chilling.
Yep.
Hello.
Hey.
So I don't know when JB is exactly gonna be here because I told him initially it could be like in like 40 minutes, so he'll just kind of join whenever. But the reason I wanted to talk to him is like, I was like kind of watching Twitter. I like just got back from vacation, and I saw like a bunch of different takes about just like where mythic rating is at the moment, because like it all stemmed from like a lot of people, I guess, complaining that it's been nerfed too much or that the raid was like too hard, and then I think that just led into a much broader conversation about like mythic's difficulty in general. Like Final Fantasy has a good system that works for them, extremely different how gear works in both of the games respectively, but like it's always fun to look at like how that would look, or if that's how that could apply to this game. And specifically, JB was, Mythic Pluser. I only raid for gear. Why can't I have the best gear? Why do I have to do this mode? I think Nagura actually has excellent perspective. Former multiple world first raider, current caster for the world first race. But I think you also do a ton of Mythic Plus, and you also raid in a guild that gets cutting edge, right? So like I think you're a good person to like represent the like mid-level, because it's not just like people who are casuals, which like that's a very broad term they use for different reasons, like people who maybe just get into mythic, or it doesn't even really apply to them, but also someone with like top level experience. And then Asmon, I know you've played at different levels throughout your time in WoW. I don't follow your alt channel, so I don't know how much you play WoW currently, but I know you've done like a lot of raid content.
I was good at the game 10 years ago.
Yeah, exactly. So and then obviously you'll have your perspective, and so we can kind of start without JB. But I know how I'm in a weird spot where like I've always kind of been on the side of, I think the race world first is such a unique thing that obviously like the whole like why would you design it for this few people kind of thing, but just almost any time historically when they've designed the game for us or made choices based on us, they were almost universally bad, not just for the whole game, but actually for us. Like they just have a fundamental misunderstanding.
Like tier gear?
Yeah, I mean, I can kind of get into some anecdotes about that specifically, but I just kind of wanted to let everyone know here, like who's talking and why, and just kind of let you guys. This is not formal at all. We can just have a big, open, broad conversation about it.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's kind of what happens is that you have the raids, and I feel like the raids have in general just over time gotten harder and harder. And if you look at the participation for the raids on, let's say, like Warcraft logs or wherever else you can actually find, and it's hard, right? It's hard to find reliable third-party information about it. But I do think that if you compare the amount of parses and the success rate of Mythic WoW, or Mythic ratings in WoW, it has gotten progressively harder. And I think that's happened at the expense of just average players that used to raid at a high level, and now they feel like they're not able to do that because of there's a number of things. You have other games that have a lower barrier to entry, like Final Fantasy. Like there's one big thing is having 20 people in the raid is probably one of the biggest reasons why raiding is hard to do now, is you just have so many people. And if you compare that to Lost Ark or Final Fantasy at least, and what happens is that I think the raids get harder and harder, and the players don't really get that much better, and it becomes more alienating to those players. And I don't think that's necessarily bad to have content that's extremely hard to do, but I think you can make a pretty strong argument that most of the content that comes out of a patch is the raid content. So if the raid content isn't really appealing or rewarding for people that are trying to participate in it, then the devs are doing a pretty big disservice to their whole community whenever they're designing content that's built around completion rates of the 1%. Like one example that I can use for this is that I think it was Ian, but I don't remember exactly who, mentioned that a raid tier should take longer than 1 week to be cleared by a guild. And I find that to be kind of a ridiculous measurement of quality, because these are people, Max and many other people like you guys raid 16 hours a day whenever these things comes out, sometimes less, but you raid a lot pretty much all day. And on top of that, your entire job is built around the game. And so I think that if you use people like that as a measurement for success, you're not looking at the other cases where 99.9% of players may run into difficulty or frustration.
No, absolutely. I think over time too. So there's a lot there, but like
Yeah, sorry.
I think yeah. No, I think like over time, that metric that they've used, like Ian has said that. I don't know if that's their
Yeah.
overall design metric, but I think it has been like generally pretty hands off for the world first. I think the only thing they've done is they've made it so like like 7 or 8 bosses in the raid, they've had rhetoric before where they're saying, oh well, the only people who are seeing these bosses this week are those guilds. So we don't have to worry about tuning these bosses right now for them, at least damage and healing wise. So that allows us to get to them, do them, and then like naturally when guilds get to them with lockouts of gear, those bosses are easier. I think that played out through most of Legion. WoD and Mop were a bit different, although I will say the overall, if you want to talk like historically about the difficulty of raiding in this game, I think 25-man Heroic and Mythic kind of continued along the same path. Like the times, I can't speak much for like the mid-level, like the person who guts cutting edge but maybe closer to the end of the patch. I can't speak for difficulty for them, but specifically time taken to clear for world first has been almost consistent, if any time actually longer back in the day, back when there's 25-man Heroic all the way through Mythic, and it's kind of gotten to the around a median level of about 8 or 9 days after it's released to be cleared now, with this raid being a giant outlier, and then in the opposite direction, things like Emerald Nightmare being a giant outlier. But I think over time, like the progression experience has been good for people. It's just that with more of the reliance on weak auras over time, I think what you've seen more than like obviously the general player base is getting better over that period, but I think the rate at which the very top levels are getting better and the things they're using to support themselves, like weak auras, are actually progressing at a rate that's far beyond that. And I think that's kind of how you ended up in Sepulture.
It's an artificial skill gap, yeah.
Yeah, but I think Sepulture was, I actually don't know how bad it was for, like the other raids in this expansion, specifically Castle Nathri. I think Castle Nathri was almost an example of really good difficulty, and it kind of shows why. I don't know. Did you raid in Castle Nathria?
Yeah, well, I didn't do Mythic. I did like half of it, but that was about it. So like
Okay.
I don't know Stone Legion Generals and Denathrius, but I know all the other fights.
But a lot of the like later fights in that raid were hard for the right reason.
Like
a lot of it
Sludge
was, yeah, Sludge Fist, and then very much like Denathrius was just attrition. You just got better at it over time. I think where Sepulture and why this is more of a conversation now and why they've really messed this up is clearly this is for the first, and this is the first time they've ever done this, in my opinion. I think you might argue that they've done this before. This, in my opinion, this raid was the first time they've ever actually been like, okay, we have this product in the Raced World first that's marketing our game, and like, let's just make it the biggest and best it can be. The primary difference there across everything else, the thing that I've noted is, in the past, every boss we've killed in the past 3 years has been killable in week 1. It was possible to kill. The last boss was tuned to be killable in the first week. This raid, the 7th boss and onward, was tuned to be killed with exactly the gear we had at the time, and because of the progression system in the patch, that ended up being the last boss was able to be tuned and killed by the best guilds in like week 3. And that has to do with it mechanically as well. Like Anduin, right? What they're nerfing about this raid, like people will talk a lot about, how, oh well, usually everyone gets a bunch of gear after the world first, so it's mitigated that way. In this raid, we had all the gear by the time it was killed, and then also the things that were wiping you were not things. They used to basically tune the numbers around the world first race always, and I think that worked out fine over a patch. This raid, they tuned it mechanically, and things like Anduin, you learn that fight 2 seconds at a time, because everything is like you either do it or you don't, and that's it. It's over. There's no like limping for 2 minutes and continuing to learn, and that's exactly much of the same on Jailer, Lihivum. A bunch of fights on Mythic have those kind of mechanics, and I think that's the reason why this raid has seemed worse than others, because of that decision. And sorry, Nagura, I know you haven't been able to talk a lot. Sorry.
All good, all good. I do think that, like, I generally agree with everything you guys are saying, and I think Sepulcher is also a tier where, honestly, I think Blizzard did not think it would go this way. I think Blizzard would thought that you guys go in, didn't expect the Race Will First guilds to get 4-set pretty quickly, and just kind of assumed they're going to tune it around you not having 4-set, and also tune it around you not having the second legendary, right? I think that was their plan. But then they realized, oh, you guys are doing the whole trading thing and you have the 4-set, and all of a sudden they needed to keep the bosses as difficult, or maybe even buff them, because that happened, right? Before you guys reached bosses, they even buffed some of them. And then this whole problem happened where they had to actively nerf bosses instead of passively nerfing them through gear progression, which is what they usually try to do. And most people don't complain too much about passive nerfs if it's through player power that you're gaining over the course of a couple of weeks, because then it's not as obvious, first of all, that it's getting nerfed. And additionally, the nerf also happens gradually over time, and not all of a sudden, you're progressing a boss, and then the next day, like, a mechanic works completely differently, or 10% of the HP has been removed, right? Because that is also a problem for people who are currently progressing, because it feels like, oh, if we just would have killed it yesterday, it would have been a bigger achievement compared to killing it today after it was nerfed, right?
I think that's very true. I mean, if you go back and you look at pretty much every expansion in recent history, there has been a cascading or increasing power buff to players. In ICC, you had the ICC buff. In Dragon Soul, you had a debuff. In Mists of Pandaria, you had, remember, you were able to upgrade your gear 2 of 2 and then 4 of 4 that would make it better. And you had the Legendary Cloak. And then in WoD, you had the Legendary Ring that got more powerful. Legion, you had the, different artifact trait levels that would just make you passively stronger over time. And BFA, we had corruptions. So it's like, this is probably one of the first patches that we've had, expansions we've had in really a very long time, where there's not a just consistently increasing power gap. And you're right that whenever you have like a flattened nerf to the boss, it feels like there's a weird psychology that I think happens whenever people build their character up more powerful over time through, like, let's say legendary rings and WoD or something like that, where they feel like they've kind of owned or earned that progression, versus whenever a nerf happens and now it's just simply easier. It's more on the nose and it doesn't feel as it doesn't feel earned.
Yeah.
See, yes, but I think, I don't know how many people are actually affected by that. So I've heard a lot of people, especially like a lot of my peers, complaining about the nerfs to this raid recently. I feel like a lot of them are very justified. They're like blasting the raid for sure, but I wonder who's actually negatively affected by it. You see a lot of like default Twitter eggs, just saying, oh man, like my achievement is ruined. Like, honestly, I feel like the people who are progressing on, let's just say, a boss like Halandris, and they get it to 2%, and the weekly reset rolls over, and it gets buffed to 30-second bombs, and they are robbed of that experience, and that, like, oh man, like, I wish we would have got the kill before the boss was massively easier. But I think there's a very small amount of those people, because I think realistically, if you've already killed the fight, it's like, oh, easier reclears now, and we spend less time in the raid. That's great. That's cool. Why would you ever be mad about that? And then the people doing it, eventually, maybe one person in an entire guild actually feels that way. Like, it's like a super long, month-long time commitment to get cutting edge for so many players. They're just trying to get through the raid and get their gear and get out. There's just so many people like that I don't know if those people's experiences are necessarily trivialized, especially in a raid like this where there is no expansion ending system that's making this easier. Like, the only way to make this raid easier, which you can see with statistics like this raid, especially Anduin, is a massive wall. Like, they're not really getting past it, and something has to change there. Oh, what's up, Jeb?
What up?
Hello. I do want to say something about that, just because I do think you're right that a lot of people mainly raid Mythic nowadays for the gear, and not necessarily for like any bigger achievements. I'm sure there are people like that still that raid for the achievements, especially like the first couple of guilds that clear the raid, like Race to World First and whatever. And like mid-tier guilds, I would say, would like play for gear rather than for achievements. But I think that has changed over the history of raiding for like a negative way, and I do think that can be improved again. I don't think it has to be this way, right? I don't think Mythic raiding should only be for gear, and it should still be enjoyable for you to get a difficult boss done and not be like, oh, finally it got nerfed and I can kill it. Mm-hmm. And especially when it comes to these active nerfs, I also think it's much, much better if you can somehow turn those nerfs off, like the ICC buff, like Asmon mentioned, that was a buff that happened over weeks. But if you wanted to turn off the buff, you could. At least you have the option to. Not that many people would have done that,
Yeah,
but
that's
if
my
you like
issue.
want to try, you know.
That's my issue, because Final Fantasy does this really well as well. You can go back and do, it's a little different because of scaling and job changes, but you can go back and do old encounters at min eye level and do it
Exactly, yeah.
somewhat close to what was done back then. Not really, but like you can make it challenging if you want. My only issue is, and I thought about this too, I was like, what if they, what if there was this feat of strength mode where Mythic was tuned to be a bit easier, but like, you could go and set your mode to whatever the world first kills had at the time, and you can have the exact same tuning and everything, and you can try for it. And I was just thinking, like, yeah, that sounds really cool for exactly like 100 people. I don't know if there's a big enough market of people with how long the slog is in a season in WoW that would actually ever get a group of people, especially their own guild. It'd probably have to be a bunch of people from different guilds to go back and actually spend time and do that. I don't think there's a huge market of people that would actually be interested in doing those things.
You can look at
I do.
Oh, go ahead, Negro.
I just quickly wanted to say I think the market would be much bigger if the raid size for the hardest difficulty would be lower,
Less,
right?
yeah.
Like Asmon said earlier. Because yeah, finding 19 people that are going to do a raid that is more difficult just because is going to be very hard. But if you only need to find like, I don't know, 9 players or like a smaller amount, then I think the incentive is going to be a lot bigger and people would be more motivated to try. Same as in Final Fantasy XIV, where people choose to go back and do old raids for fun, right?
I think that we've already seen this happen before. If you look at something like Herald of the Titans, that's effectively kind of what you're talking about. Now, obviously, the people that cleared it at the beginning were probably using a mismatch of gear, and there have been times where Herald of the Titans is 3-manable. But the idea of going back and being able to do challenges that are at a certain item level, and there was also another one in TOGC. It was called Argent Defender, tribute to Dedicated Insanity, and that one was removed. But you can still go back and get Herald of the Titans now. I think the reason why you have a lot more population of people that are like doing, let's say, like Ultimates in Final Fantasy or viewing them positively, is that I think there's a perception, and this is a perception that I have, is that the tuning and the focusing around making sure that the fine-tuning of the raid, like in a way, just the idea that guilds clearing it very quickly, like a professional guild clearing this on week 1, is even a problem that needs to be solved. I think is problematic, because this is not something that's it's not something that affects an average player. It's not the average player experience, and I think that in many cases it's the opposite of the average player experience, especially whenever you talk about mechanical difficulty for certain fights. So you look at something like Star Augur, for example, the mechanical difficulty is going to be much harder whenever you're dealing with like a more casual guild. And whenever you have like insta-wipe mechanics like that, it becomes really difficult to see an average guild or like a more casual guild progress on it. And whenever gear is locked behind it, then you have even more frustration.
I think
you guys may have covered this before I got in, so I apologize. But in a general sense, do you guys think Final Fantasy XIV's raid format is better or worse than mine? And like, independent of the actual bosses themselves, like boss design, in terms of the size of the raids, the way the loot works, I'll admit I'm not very familiar with it, but I feel like every time I go on Twitter and I'm like, man, I'd really like to see Blizzard do like X, Y, or Z with raiding. Someone's like, oh, it's actually the way it works in Final Fantasy 14.
Well, I feel like Final Fantasy, well, there's 2 parts of that. There's the way the raids work and then looting. So I feel like one reason why it's really hard to compare so many things between the 2 games is that gear is handled entirely differently.
Yeah.
Like, if you think about the way you play WoW on a new season, basically why you're making any decision you make when you log in is to get more gear from the second the season starts until the second it ends. It's like the whole progression of gear, even when WoW has been at its best, that's been why you were playing the game. And Final Fantasy gear is almost a means to an end. It's something you get from the raid content that isn't required, that's usually based off of a side story, and you get it and it's fine. And then like the hardest difficulty, it's so hard to tell difficulties because it's more like a bunch of fights mashed in one, extremely difficult, especially the recent one. It doesn't loot things and it's only cosmetic. But the thing is like getting gear and getting the best gear is so much more core to WoW than that game. And then about the raid size, there's about half as many jobs as there are specs in WoW. And I think it's possible that if you were to, like, especially at this point, drop back into a lower amount of players, my take is that I think it would compromise the integrity of raid encounters in WoW specifically. But I think if I was making a new game that was exactly like WoW, literally the same game, I think I would make it with 10 or less, because that's just like how people play games in 2022. There's just, you have like small groups of friends you play games with. You just don't, like, having a 20-man team in today's day and age is like pretty impossible. But I don't know if that's actually the route you would ever go down for WoW specifically.
Well, you can look at Classic WoW, and there's a lot of people that raided in Classic WoW with 40 members, and now you see, like, I was comparing the amount of, like, clears from Sunwell versus Sepulchre, and Sunwell, like, just for one spec, like, for Destruction Warlock, there was, like, 600,000 parses of just Destruction Warlocks in Sunwell Plateau. So I think that the size of the raid is important, especially whenever you're dealing. It's kind of like an inverse thing, where the harder the content is, the more frustrating it is to have a lot of people. And, like, I think you even saw
Definitely.
that, yeah, with, like, Nax in Classic WoW. It's like, okay, now we have a raid where one person can wipe the raid, and there's 40 people, and it took 2 hours to get here. That makes it way harder. I think that it's very hard to compare Final Fantasy rating with WoW rating, but I do think that, like, Max, you bring up a good point, that there are effectively way more variables in WoW rating, and I think that because there are so many more variables, you do have situations where fights are either very overtuned or undertuned. And you had this especially happen in Cataclysm when you had 10 mans versus 25 mans, and you had some bosses that were just, you know, impossible on 10 man, and then other fights that were just impossible on 25 man for a lot of guilds, and swapping to 10 or 25 inversely would just make it easy.
Correct. Yeah. Go ahead, Negro.
I quickly wanted to say that I think a big reason why they divided the difficulties in the raids in the first place, like their goal when they started doing normal mode, heroic, mythic, was to kind of cover each player base, because a lot of people were raiding from the start of World of Warcraft, but after a couple of years, it turned out, oh, there's people who are much more hardcore than others are, right? So they decided, okay, let's just split the raid to cater to those different kinds of player bases that raid for different reasons. So we have normal mode, we have heroic, and we have mythic. And mythic's intention, obviously, was to be the hardest version of the raid, to cater towards people who really want the challenge. And I think it worked out really well at the start. But over the years, as you guys have been saying, gear just became so important in WoW, and people are striving so much to get gear upgrades and player power upgrades. Even people that are like more casual, quote unquote, they're just do mythic for the gear and maybe also do heroic for the gear, and don't necessarily seek the challenge anymore. So I think their whole point of dividing the difficulties kind of failed nowadays. Like, it worked out in the past, but now it's just kind of redundant, because everyone ends up doing mythic anyway, just because they want the item level, because it drops the highest item level. So I do think just approaching WoW rating the same way as Final Fantasy XIV, with having like an ultimate version that scales your gear and possibly does not drop item upgrades, would really kind of solve a lot of issues that WoW rating nowadays has, because then they can really cater that kind of ultimate version around those players who only seek the challenge, and maybe the heroic version of the raid would be a little bit easier, like for normal raiders that seek a challenge but not like an insane challenge, and they would still get the highest item level there. And it's also flexible raids that we have in heroic, right, where you can go in with 10 people or with 20 or with 30 or whatever. And I think it would really like motivate a lot more people to do raiding again if it drops the highest item level on heroic. And I know there's going to be a lot less people who are going to do this kind of ultimate version of the raid if it doesn't drop item upgrades, for sure. But I still think the existence of it is still important, just to have like an aspiration to maybe go for in the future, and to see those players who have those transmogs walking around, because it works in Final Fantasy XIV as well with the ultimates. Because there isn't a lot of players that actually do ultimates, but people still like that it exists, and they want it to be like good raids, and they like watching the other players walk around with those beautiful transmogged weapons, right?
Well, they also have that in Lost Ark too. They have the Hell mode,
Yeah.
which is where your item level is locked, your your abilities are, well, you can change your abilities, but like the amount of skill points you have is locked, and like the boss is basically in its hardest version, and you can go back and do it. I think that would be a lot better, and I do think that a lot of it does come from people not being able to get the best gear, because WoW players, especially now, and I think it's become this way to a fault, is that WoW players are extremely goal oriented. Right, everything is like constantly min-maxed, and people are trying to play the game in the most efficient and optimized way possible.
Do you think that people in WoW are more likely to raid Mythic because of the gear it drops, or raid Mythic because they like it?
I think that if you took gear out of Mythic raiding, participation would drop by at least 90%.
Yeah, and it's honestly one of the weirdest. There's a few justifications I see people give on Twitter often for like why they think Mythic should drop the best gear, and like one of the weirdest ones to me is when people say you have to put the best gear in there or nobody's going to do it, and it's like, well, hold on, let me run this back. You're telling me the only reason that you raid is for gear, and if you stop getting gear, you'd stop raiding. This is not a very good argument for why like raiding should continue to exist in its current form. Like that it's like so tedious that the only reason you'd go there is to get gear.
That's me.
This sounds like a problem and something that we should be trying to solve. And if people are only showing up to get gear, that doesn't sound like a good status quo.
First of all, I don't know about that argument specifically. Like like someone making an argument that like I would only do it for gear. I would say, like, at least in the people who are actually playing the most in WoW, it's actually interesting because like we clear and then we just like raid very casually for like the rest of the patch, right? Like the people who spend the most time doing their like raid schedule are like people who are getting cutting edge near the end. The thing is those guilds continue and do that and usually have 278 gear, which is what Mythic drops, far before they are done actually progressing the raid. I think there's a lot of people. I think it's just accessibility with Mythic. I think if you find a team of people you like, I actually don't know how much better content there is than WoW raiding, at least if you like MMO stuff. I think it's just super hard to find a team, keep 20 people happy that like each other, and then obviously the barrier of entry. I think they've done a good job reducing that, and I hope they continue to do it more. Like cross faction will help that immensely. I think making Mythic lockouts work like heroic will help immensely. So you don't feel like you're tied. You don't want to go kill. What's the first boss this raid?
Vigilant Guardian, I think.
Yeah, you don't want to go join some group on Skolex because you want your Vigilant Guardian loot for the week. Like, so that person isn't applying to that group who needs a 20th person. And then also Cross Realm being available from the start. But I don't know if like reducing the amount of people would make that better, because I think raiding in WoW is like really, really sick at all levels. It's I just think specifically in this raid they kind of stepped out of line. And one thing I wanted to mention, because I don't know how much longer you have, Asmon, but I wanted
5 minutes,
yeah, I wanted to point out a take you had about them designing things with the world first race in mind. From our perspective, anytime, and there's not many times that have been like this, where I feel like that they have actually made changes or done things, and it's because of the world first race, they've almost all ended in disaster or they've been terrible decisions. I'll use an anecdote from this raid. If you remember, they made tier chest and tier shoulders? Is that what drops off of Lords of Dread and Rygalon? I think it is. Yep. Those pieces could not drop out of your box for the first week, and like almost verbatim from what they said, and just in general, they did it so World First Guilds could not attain 4-piece faster than they wanted. And then we were like, that's going to change nothing with what we do. All it's going to do is make it RNG on which one of our players gets 4-piece, but we'll still have 20 in the raid. So it's like a bad decision for us, and it clearly getting 4-piece took way too long this patch. The creation catalyst could have, for the community. The creation catalyst could have solved that, but that could have solved it as well. But the point is that there was an interview with Morgan Day 2 weeks after the race ended, maybe 1 week. And he was talking about how excited he was to go into work on Tuesday and just be like, oh man, it's Mythic Tuesday. How many bosses are going to be dead? I wonder how these guilds are doing. And it blew our mind, everyone involved in this, that anyone at Blizzard who is involved in making decisions because they think they understand the race could have ever thought that we would have done anything other than do splits for multiple days. Because that's just the way they made this patch. And I think their fundamental misunderstanding of really what we're going to do and how it works really makes for some very interesting decision making when they're doing it based on us, but they don't really know what we're going to do or why. The reality is we're always going to do the most degen, time-consuming shit to make ourselves stronger, and almost any decision they could possibly make to mitigate that is just going to end up affecting other people for no reason. And I think a lot of things, especially like removal of master loot and things like that, have all come from that. Like when they removed master loot, that was their main thing. They were like, he said it in an interview, I want to remove splits. You're never going to remove splits, man.
Well, it's like the thing is that's the way I feel, is I feel like that's a huge problem, because removing master loot affects the entire player base, and it's things where a decision is made in order to curtail or to prevent like a 1 or 2% of the player base from playing the game in some way that they consider degenerate. And it's like, where is the value in this? Like, is this really making the game better? If Creation Catalyst came out on release, or it came out pretty much the same time that the game came out, or maybe a week or two after, I think that it would have just been a better experience for average players. And I think that WoW has had an increasingly bigger problem where it tries to cater its content towards the bottom and top 10% of players, and the 80% in the middle, I think those are the people that are going and looking elsewhere to other games, and, just kind of drifting away from the game because they see design decisions like this, like these weird convoluted tier trading rules that nobody asked for. Like, why is this even in the game? It's like,
it's only because of the race. That's it.
Yeah.
But the thing is we don't want them to do. Like, I'm telling you, like almost any time they do stuff like that, we don't want them to do that.
It makes your life harder. Like, and that's the problem. Is like, I think that some people might view like what I've said as like I am considering like, oh, it's like your fault, it's Limit's fault or Echo's fault that this is happening. I actually think it's the opposite. I think that Blizzard is making the game worse because of the way that you guys want to play the game. And I think if anybody dislikes it, it's going to be you guys, because I'm assuming that whenever you had Master Loot, you probably didn't have to do as many splits, did you? Probably not.
Well, so no back then, but if they brought it back, there would be just as many as there are now, just because there's nothing else to do. But what Personal Loot did was, when Master Loot, you went in there, you had a goal, and you got exactly what you went in to get. Personal Loot just makes it like this super random RNG, and you're doing all of that work, and it feels like shit because you're doing it for like an extremely inefficient amount of time. That's the thing that makes it feel bad.
Yeah,
like making 5 of the same character plus kind of thing.
It's weird. It's the same thing that happened at the beginning of Legion 2 with the legendaries, and it's again like them trying to. I think Blizzard oftentimes tries to control player behavior, and it happens at the expense of the players. It's like they see problems that aren't there, and problems that nobody really has except for themselves, and that's what my concern is.
I just quickly want to say, like, one argument that I always bring up whenever people talk about Master Loot, this does not affect like the top end. It also doesn't affect the lower end, but like the mid tier.
Yeah.
And that is that Master Loot actually really promotes split rating for mid tier guilds. Because before they removed Master Loot, there was actually a lot of guilds that were like, I would say between top 50 and top 500 that started doing at least one single split raid, which only required one single ult, right? So it wasn't like a huge effort, but it basically doubled the amount of loot you got in Heroic, because you could just split your mains into 2 raids, right? And as soon as they introduced personal loot, that stopped. Like, mid-tier guilds completely stopped doing split raids. And I still think it would be true that if you bring back Master Loot, that this would happen again, that mid-tier guilds either feel the need to do split raids or have a pretty big disadvantage if they don't do it at all. So that is like a slight argument for personal loot, at least for these like mid-tier mythic rating guilds.
Yeah, I can see that, and I think that's kind of just what's going to happen. I mean, at a certain point, you're always going to have people that will try to take advantage of whatever tool that they have, and that's always it's like, is this really like a big problem though? And I think that's kind of like where like my perspective comes in, is like, let's say 100 or 200 guilds feels like they need to do 2 heroic clears in the first week of a tier. Is this really a reason to completely reimagine the way that a loot system in the game works for 15 years? I feel like, to me, it seems like these are problems that are not really in need of a solution.
Maybe, yeah.
Yeah. But
I think everybody knows how I feel about personal loot. And I will say that to me, one of the most frustrating parts of the loot system in raids is that very often the arguments in favor of master loot come from, I think, the perspective of, I want my raid to do as well as I want the people in my raid, my guild, to be able to do as well as possible. I'm willing to sort of subjugate my desires as an individual player for the collective of the guild, so that the guild can do the best thing possible.
Yes.
And that's cool if raiding is your top priority. But there's a lot of people in this game whose raiding is not their top priority. And like when I go raid, I'm there for the loot. Like that's 100%. Like I've got guildmates I like. It's cool to raid with them and I enjoy it. But like I'm here to get loot because I'm gonna go do Mythic Plus after that. And giving loot to somebody else in the raid might make us clear the raid faster. It doesn't help me do Mythic Plus, which is what I'm here to do. And so I appreciate why you would want to have master loot, but it also comes from a very like sort of different perspective than some people in the game have. And it's my primary problem with that raid system is it's like I think it's disingenuous to pretend like there aren't a lot of people here just for the loot, and giving that away defeats the entire purpose of why I'm here.
yeah, I mean, your take is, like, I'm assuming you would never do raids if you could get the best gear in the game from doing Mythic Plus, right?
I mean, I'm like, I don't know, maybe like honestly,
that's
I
what
kind
I
of
do.
enjoy raiding for like the first month of, like, I remember when we were progressing Heroic Anduin, I was like, this is a sick fight. Like I'm enjoying this. Like this is a fun thing. But I just I get tired of it after a while. If I only ever raided for like the first month and a half, or if it went to farm schedule really quickly and it was just like log in for 4 or 5 hours a week and clear the raid and get your loot and get out of there, I don't think I'd ever have a problem with it. The issue I have is when I find myself in tiers like this, and honestly, I mean, this one's longer than most, but there's always in a guild at my level, which is like World 500, you're always getting to one of these bosses in like the 3rd or 4th month of the tier, and you're like, I'm so fucking done with this. Like, I just want all the bosses to be dead so we can start farming. And this was fun for a couple months, but like I'm ready to move on.
That's a problem with this raid specifically, though. Like, I think there's a lot of raids that are exactly like that. I think what Blizzard should aim to do when they're designing raids, they should actually completely don't care about the world first race. I don't think that would necessarily trivialize it. I still think it would take about a week or more if they did this, because they've done this well in the past. Is like, it should be very linear. Like, you should go in a raid, and they should, for the people who clear cutting edge, just cutting edge or a little bit off cutting edge or whatever, like those people who are doing mythic content, every boss you get to should be like a slight thing up from the beginning or from the previous one, and there shouldn't be any like gigantic like walls. Like, I think walls are like, I guess hardcore players like really want them.
I think Siege was
because-
a good example of that, where it
Yeah,
was very
yeah.
progressive.
But like I feel like hardcore players see bosses like Gore Fiend and Painsmith and Ashara, and they're like, yeah, I love a good mid-raid wall. Dude, I think like in general the community doesn't like those, and I think it turns a lot of people off raiding. I think Painsmith, albeit 9.1, was like probably the worst patch I've ever seen in this game, but like Painsmith murdered guilds because that boss, like, it doesn't make any sense for a boss to be that hard right in the middle of the raid, and then right after that it's a cakewalk, and then you make it to the end. It just kills guilds. That the Siege of Orgrimmar is one of the best examples of progressive difficulty through a raid. The most recent version would be Castle Nathru. Castle Nathru is also fantastic with that. It was just almost by the boss, it was slightly harder than the previous one in the way that you went. And they should be tuning it for that, and that also lends well to a good raid for the race world first. That's exactly what are good raids for us too.
It's anticlimactic. After you kill a boss, it's super hard, and then you just roll over the next two. I do have to go. Thank you, guys. I wish I would talk about this for 10 hours, but I have to go.
All good, dude.
Thanks for having me.
Good
Have a good one.
Yeah,
See you later. Okay, guys, I have to go. I don't know if you know that. I'd have to go. Thanks for watching. I really appreciate it. I have to go help my dad with something, and I will be back online tomorrow morning because we're going to be playing Final Fantasy. All right, boys. Peace.